Our fourth speaker of this session is Antoine Picon. Professor Picon is the G. Ware Travelstead Professor of the History of Architecture and Technology and co-director of doctoral programs at the GSD, and Professor Picon teaches history and the theory of architecture and technology. Professor Picon received engineering degrees from the École Polytechnique and from the École Nationale de Ponts et Chaussées, an architecture degree from the École d'Architecture de Paris-Villemin, and a doctorate in history from the École de Haute Études and Sciences Sociales. He works on the history of architectural and urban technologies from the 18th century to the present, and his most recent book, Digital Culture and Architecture, An Introduction for the Design Profession, was published in 2010. And offers it a comprehensive overview and discussion of the changes brought about by the computer to the theory and practice of architecture. Professor Picon is now also developing an essay on ornament. Professor Picon, I welcome you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me with you today and tomorrow. Is drawing dead? It's a question that is worth asking because there are other disciplines in which drawing died a long time ago. I began actually my career by studying engineering history, and if you study engineering history, you discover that actually by the mid-19th century, the practice of drawing as the basis of the engineering profession began to decline very sharply and very rapidly. So is drawing dead in architecture? This is definitely a question, but the question is obscured, in my opinion, by at least two phenomena. The first has to do with the diversity of roles that drawing used to play and still play very often from the earliest stages of conception to the final rendering phases. What is taking place today is perhaps more a shrinkage of the spectrum of these uses than a disappearance proper of drawing. The second phenomenon is the thick layer of ideology, professional ideology, that has always accompanied the question of drawing from the Renaissance onwards. Indeed, drawing played a fundamental role, as we all know, in the very definition of the architect, as opposed to the various craftsmen that contributed to the realization of buildings. So before discussing what is happening today with the rise of digital tools and culture, what I would like to do is to examine a bit more closely these two phenomena. This is, in my opinion, one of the conditions to be able to understand a little better what's happening today. The diversity of roles played traditionally by drawing is striking by comparison to its present function in our computer-aided design age. Drawing was the tool and okay, keyboard, yes. Well, keyboard seems to be resisting too. Well, as you can see.
So much for the digital age. If I'm helping, you know we're in trouble.
Thank you. One of the limits of the digital. So drawing was the tool for the first sketch, and more generally for the core task of conception. And here we have the famous initial sketch of Paxton, or one of the first initial sketches for the Crystal Palace. Drawing was also a tool of communication towards the client and the public at large, and the Lenox library of John Dixon Hunt, this drawing is a good example of that. Finally, drawing served to communicate with the artisans and workers of all kinds that intervene in the building process. But beyond these roles, drawing was also a mean, and it has been outlined various times this afternoon, to explore the visible world. It was a tool of investigation also of the underlying structure that were supposed to organize this world. One of the functions of drawings was, among other things, to relate the natural and the human realms. The visible world was indeed a mix of natural and artificial objects, and its underlying structure were supposed to bridge these two domains. It's quite interesting, by the way, that Viollet-le-Duc, the 19th century architect, famous treatise on the role of drawing, Histoire d'un dessinateur, History of a Draftsman, insist a lot on this relation between the natural and the artificial, the natural and the human. With a couple of ideas, one of them that comes again and again in the history of a draftsman is that nature actually is the first draftsman. And a pretty amusing illustration is this picture in which what the draftsman does is actually to emulate nature's power for delineation. And we see on the left the lines on the cliffs on the French side of the channel, and the master draftsman in a way teaches his pupil to emulate nature when he explains to him the principle of altitude contour lines. So nature had already done something like that on the cliffs. Like nature, the draftsman was supposed to draw all the time. Drawing was not only a practice, it was a lifestyle and an ethics. And this is the meaning of the motto at the beginning of Viollet-le-Duc's book, Nulla dies sine linea. And this is why I've chosen Viollet-le-Duc, because it provides a good transition towards the ideological role of drawing in architecture. Drawing enabled the architect to appear both as an artist, imparted with an individual genius, and as the natural coordinator and rulers of the other crafts and trades involved in the realization of buildings. And I spoke of the relation between nature and the human. It's worth noting, of course, that genius designated originally a natural disposition. And genius enabled, very literally to bridge the distance, the alleged distance between the natural and the human. And this was one of the things that the talented artist could do. And actually, the drawing of ornament had something to do with that. By extending from the initial sketches that carried the essential idea, the first thought, to the graphic documents necessary for education, drawing was supposed to be the guarantee that a seamless flow linked the various stages of design and realization. This is an idea that is still quite present in the 20th century. For example, if Jean Prouvais's conception of design and of drawing, and the way he relates drawing to what he called the constructive idea, that is to say the essential impetus, the essential dynamism of the constructor thought and practice, is something that is clearly related to that. And Prouvé insisted constantly on the fact that drawing was just the embodiment of this flow that led from the initial thought to the prototyping and then possibly industrial realization. Now, this traditional set of roles of drawings is definitely challenged by the computer. And I'll come back to this issue in a moment. But once again, the question of what is exactly happening today is often obscured by this diversity of role played by drawing, and very often we tend to confuse all of them. And it's probably worth, in some ways, paying more attention to the various situations in which drawing used to appear. And once again, it is also made difficult by what I would like to call an anxiety. There is an anxiety with drawing today, and that has to do, of course, with what is maybe the role of the architect. By the way, it's worth noting 1.5 centuries ago, engineers, when drawing began to enter into engineering drawing, it began to enter into a crisis. They had a very similar kind of anxiety about where was engineering going. So drawing remains for sure today very present at a lot of moments. It's present at the beginning and at key moments in the conception process, and it seems to me very improbable that this is going to disappear. But on the other hand, drawing has lost a large part of its role in the communication with the client, and above all, as a tool of communication between the various professions involved in the realization of a building. We have entered the age of computer-generated views and animation, for the better and for the worse, and even more, the age of BIMs, the building information models, which are clearly substituting themselves. Database, in some ways, are replacing some of the traditional function imparted to drawing. So the pending question is whether drawing will lose also its role as a privileged means to explore the visible world and investigate its underlying structure in a way drawing as a form of humanism. And there again, being an historian, and since this is an historical session, one could perhaps have talked a little bit more on photography, because photography created a very similar set of issues during the second half of the 19th century. And the Histoire d'un dessinateur, the history of a draftman of Viollet-le-Duc, is written by somebody who was very aware of the impact of photography. And actually, Viollet collected photographs. He had a photographic collection. So, this is a question that will go on during the first decades of the 20th century, and a lot of studies have shown, for example, how reinforced concrete is a mode of construction, but also an architecture that develops in an intimate connection with photography. This is an NB construction site, but even more interestingly, a scholar like Régent Legault has argued that this weird and kitschy realization by Enbeek is photographed in a way very close to the kind of new objectivity that modern architecture, a few years after the production of such a drawing, construction, will use to photograph the buildings. So it is perfectly conceivable that documenting or surrounding visible world will be more and more systematically delegated to a complex mix of digital media, including photography, video, blogging. It might be true that, we spend less time and we attach less personal memory to a single digital photo, but let me remind you that we take hundreds of them today. It's almost movie-like. We take also little movies, we blog, we do all these things that create this thick layer of experience through digital media. So in summary, drawing is certainly not disappearing, but it's true that something like a vital thread linking conception and realization, design and the exploration of the surrounding visible world, design and design speculation seems to have become fragile to the point that it could be even broken. So why does this perspective create such an anxiety? Because it seems to endanger, once again, something that appears precisely as vital both to the definition of the architect and to his status vis-à-vis his professional partners. I think this is reinforced by a very curious professional situation, which is namely that the generation that is now in command in architectural practices is usually a generation that do not master the use of the computer. It's actually the younger one who do. So it's a very strange world in which even many of the so-called digital architects actually delegate the manipulation of software, etc., to younger. So why do we, however, if we go beyond that, have this impression of something vital that accompanied traditional drawing uses? And this is where, and this will echo strangely, despite our differences of theoretical orientation, what Juhani said before me, this is now where one has to introduce another fundamental dimension in the affair, the body, or to be more accurate, the relation between mind, hand, and material medium, and material medium, that is, and what seems, and this is where the hand, I had a picture of the hand, but which got lost in the final version of this PowerPoint, but this is, we've seen a lot of hands before, so just imagine, a hand. So the question is, if what seems to be lost is a creative immediacy that digital media doesn't seem to make possible, can one, however, recapture such immediacy by an appropriate combination of digital media? And this is perhaps one of the questions raised by the eclipse of drawing today. So since I'm playing the role of the guy who likes digital technology, even if I cannot push a button on a computer, I will personally take the position that such an evolution is actually not only possible, but that it will take place. It does not mean, and I'll come back to this issue toward the end of what I want to say today, doesn't mean that necessarily all is good with such an evolution. Actually, technological change is rarely entirely beneficial, and something is almost unavoidably lost in any kind of technological transition. But nothing, in my opinion, but our own ideological prejudices enable us to conclude that we cannot recover some kind of vital link between our mind and the world through the use of digital media. And phenomenology, for example, which is often mobilized to justify these hypotheses, often make also another hypothesis, which is that the body of man is not as flexible as it is actually. And speaking, for example, there is a lot of flexibility in our body, and without necessarily entering into a discussion on cyborg-oriented prosthesis, post-human perspectives, etc., I would like to go back to this idea of body image. It's true that the hand, for example, is present in our brain, and this is part extremely present, but on the other hand, the brain is constantly wiring and rewiring itself, and partly in contact with the tools that surround it. And just like the brain rewired itself when we began to be surrounded by simple tools like hammers, etc., then by more complicated machine, what is might very probably be happening in the future is a rewiring in which the mental image of the body will change in relation to the use of digital tools. You have also a number of neurologists today that say, for example, that the use of the thumb image in the brain has grown with the use of Game Boy among teenagers. And it's true that, the hand has not really disappeared, even if it's very concentrated into a couple of fingers with many of the digital natives. So from Gregory Bateson to Bill Mitchell, what many theorists of digital media have suggested is that what is actually taking place is a radical extension of the body and also a reframing of its sensorium. So let me just insist on this thing also. When the computer appears, almost everyone believed that it was a computing machine, hence its name. And then very rapidly, and this was the von Neumann and others' revolution, one discovered that it was actually as much a logical machine. Today, the digital revolution might mean that we're discovering third phase, that actually the computer is also as much a machine to experience, a machine through which our senses are in a way redirected, reinterpreted, etc. We listen already through very often digital media. We see through digital media. If you talk to younger kids, for example, a non-clickable image or a non-zoomable image is a kind of oddity. I very often tell my students that the new form of authenticity in a museum is the non-clickable image, which is the only difference today for many kids between a painting and what they see on their computer. So we are also confronted to, so among the features of this new sensorium, I would make the hypothesis that there could very well be a stronger interaction between the various senses. Synesthesia is definitely among the characteristics of the new emerging sensorium. Senses are in an even stronger interaction than before. One of the consequences, in my opinion, of the digital is to provide a basis, both epistemological and practical, for these interactions. We are, for instance, in architecture, confronted to a new tactility and the kind of blurring between the visual and the tactile, and so many ornaments. I don't know what I did. Oh, here came my hand. So it was a total inversion. Take the tactile dimension of so many of these things we call ornament today. It's, for me, very striking that to see has become very literally the same as to touch in many projects today. So in such a perspective, many possibilities may arise for digital media to relate in this vital way to the mind and to the body, as well as to the exterior world. And this is where also the progress of interfaces, all these things that the MIT Media Lab has specialized into, do play a role in this affair. And the hand actually will be more and more present in the digital world. It's not disappearing. To the contrary, it's more and more at the center of the digital world. I remember also very well the first time I saw a student doing this gesture. First month of the iPhone, it was still tactile screens were still in their infancy, but this has become a totally natural gesture today involving the hand. To go in the same direction, artist Eric Nolder's emotional maps are based precisely on the possibility for digital media to relay information on the emotional state of the subject who is doing the mapping. So there are a number of consequences in all these affairs. One is, for me, the growing importance taken by mapping as the prototypical activity. I'm really struck by that. What people do on Facebook very often, they do not delineate their life. They map it through photos, through diverse notes, etc. And if you look at what's happening in design school, very often what you see is a kind of superabundance of mapping practices prior to the project. And this might be the most profound change, by the way, brought by parametricism. In some ways, I don't see it necessarily as a style, as some in this conference do, because I don't think it carries necessarily a cultural consensus with it, but it might express a fundamental shift in design from delineating to mapping the various parameters involved in the project. And let me remind you that diagrams are, by the end, a special case of maps. And strangely, we are now in a kind of totally inverted world in which we map and the computer delineates in some ways. So, and I will be reaching the end of this short presentation. The final question I'd like to return is what might be lost in this affair. Once again, there is no major technological evolution without a loss. Sheer progress, as we know, is a myth. So what might be lost, in my opinion, is a certain kind of deliberative simplicity. If one substitutes, for example, a practice more akin to mapping than to delineating, what may be lost is the simplicity of the decision-making of the deliberation. Drawing was like decision-making. It had a straightforwardness with it that is probably getting lost in the maze of all these mapping practices that digital technology enable us to do. Yesterday, Massimo Scolari evoked the role of drawing to ask questions rather than to solve problems, but there was always decision-making in drawing, and to draw a line was already to make a decision on the relation we had to the world. So the question then becomes, of course something will be lost, but we have to find replacement for it. So we may need to reinvent something reminiscent of the rapid links, the short circuits, if you like, between mind, hand, and decision-making in the maze of digital media. Something like, the lightning bolts that would in some ways go across the thick layers of this new digitally shaped sensorium, something like, if you want, a kind of electrical jolt, enabling this kind of decision, the return of the simplicity of the deliberative. And this is where, and I will conclude on that, it goes back to a kind of anthropological question. We may need to function in the future at two various levels. One, which is the reality of what we've become, that is a multi-layered reality, a complex sensorium in which the difference between our body and the exterior world is more and more blurred, in which, in some ways, all these neo-Leibnizian discourses among digital designers is linked to the idea that we are no longer separated from the exterior world. We are points of view on the world. So we know that on the one hand, but on the other hand, we still need to reinvent a kind of fiction about the heroic fiction of the decision-making empowered individual. And so we may actually have to reinvent the fiction of man as somebody who makes decision, which means that we may have by the end to live into culture, one which is the strange, disconcerting world of the digital, a world that demultiplies us. Sociologists like Sherry Turkle have become very afraid of the risk of a kind of a multiplication of sub-self inside personality. So that's for sure a risk for a networked individual. But this is what we are. But we must probably recreate a fiction in some other word, in that we still are simple minds making a decision in a relatively traditional fashion. And I would just like to conclude by saying that drawing used for a very long time to be something that related to both to reality and fiction. What might be lost today is the relation of drawing to reality as we knew it, but the function of drawing as a fiction has never been as urgent. Thank you very much.
Great. So if I could have the panelists come back and join me. Thank you. Antoine, you're not done. Oh, Andrea and Juhani, hi. Good afternoon. How's the volume? Okay? Hi, I'm Jennifer Liang. I teach here at the school, and I was very honored to be asked by Victor Agran and George Knight to moderate this panel. And I know that we are all very pleased to see such a vast turnout. I wanted to first thank our panelists for their provocations around what must seem like an existential question. Is drawing dead? I appreciate that this call to arms has produced a range of response. Should we resist, adapt, or perhaps, as Cammy suggests, should we... Yeah, is this on? Okay. Should we enjoy the emancipation? I know that several of you will have questions for our speakers, and we would like to prioritize that portion of the day after a brief discussion. I hope that all of the speakers would agree with me that architecture is an embodied practice. It is within our discipline and tradition that competitions between the Cartesian, the affectual, the post-hand eye, and potentially a new sensorium are played out, and that we are also constrained, productively or not, by the codification and commercialization of drawing. It's an instrument of service, a spectacular image. It at least used to guarantee certain divisions of labor that may no longer equal agency or even a livelihood if recent articles calling architecture the new English major can be believed. Sorry, Bob. At the risk of oversimplification, I'd like to think that we can challenge some of the disciplinary anxieties that we heard about today if we think about drawing as a site of contamination. And if we, as Massimo Scolari prophetically raised last night and Antoine again referenced, if we could reconsider the value of imprecision. In the first case, in terms of contamination, that drawing as an act of making something flat within a limited dimension. This is something that Bruno Latour notes. And I would also include the digital screen in this making flat. This allows for the overlap of otherwise incommensurate information. Forms of notation, different ideas, different concepts and scales. And this is a precondition for mastery. But contamination also in the sense of convention versus exception. For example, even before you got to the arguments today, there seemed to be two relatively distinct schema for how to talk about drawing or how to organize drawing's history. On the one hand, perhaps the categorical. So if Antoine begins with an enumeration of the roles of drawing within the profession, allographic, autographic, drawing from nature, and Juhani presented what, to my mind, still seems like an unassailable catalog of the functions of drawing as a technology of the self. That is, as a form of disciplining and, not to be Heideggerian, but of being in the world. The immutability of this body that draws, I think, is something that is also open to debate. By contrast, Cammy perhaps put it best in her survey of an alternative history. So if not a contaminant, then either adjacent to or distinct from various hegemonies, as Deanna also suggests. I find that the selections from the 1980s, as well as the examples of Juhani and Peruzzi that Cammy places on the margins of debates about linear perspective, et cetera, and perhaps the question of the parametric today, sit relatively uneasily against these role-bound functions of drawing, either professional or in terms of how one disciplines the self and, in a sense, learns to see. So very simply, how do we understand exception and convention? Can we think of the space of drawing as the space of contamination? Antoine, maybe not to put you on the spot necessarily, but where would you place the drawings of Juhani or Peruzzi, for example? I mean, is it really outside of this spectrum that's narrowing, or is this part of the fiction that you also alluded to, without naming perhaps that as a role of the profession?
I think the second answer, definitely for me, it's part of the fiction, and it's part of the fact that I could also define the architect as somebody who used fiction to construct material reality. So this would be where it would definitely fit. I was also struck by another thing, which is the alternative nature, and there is something there also for me which is interesting. I think in some ways I'm more optimistic about drawing, because I think drawing becomes, between brackets, more marginal than it used to be. But it gives it also, being marginal creates new possibility.
Well, I mean, I think very clearly Cammy, at least in my reading of the kind of positions, very clearly states that there's something joyful or delightful potentially in this emancipation. And I know that your expertise is in another century when this kind of problematic was also being discussed, but do you agree that the role is as a fictional role? I guess I would say is something like splayed perspective, not also a kind of cognitive structure, a new form of embodiment? Is it only a kind of, a kind of perversion of conventions?
Let me see if I understand the question. I guess what's interesting to me about the drawings that I was talking about, and what I see as their potential implication for architects now, is about the fact that they embodied a kind of liberty in thinking about the basic problem that architects face in representing space, which it's a hard problem. And they tried, the architects of the 15th and 16th century were essentially trying various things and kind of seeing if they worked. And that seems to have stopped for a long time in the way that I see it happening then, because the conventions were established and they were effective for the things that they were meant to accomplish. But yes, I think that right now, rather than kind of lamenting the fact that drawing in the construction process will never be what it was, that we can actually say, oh, okay, there's a whole world of other things that it can do.
But what would those other things be? Who I think adjudicates that? Because I guess one question, so if you do say that there's an emancipation, I feel like you're, maybe it's slightly too quick to the draw, if I could say so, that if it's emancipated, then therefore we should go back to our disciplinary alignment with art and painting. So I don't disagree with that necessarily, but I think are there other, if it can be emancipated, should we then build new disciplinary alignments Well, another example that I didn't really have time to get into, but I think it's interesting, and this may speak a little bit to the kind of direction that Antoine was suggesting, but it's slightly different, is hybridity. Or the dialogue between the digital and the hand. So that I evoked, or I showed that example of the printed book that had
writing and crossing out marks and so forth as a way of, because just like photography is maybe one earlier historical analogy for this kind of digital revolution, so is print, as Mario Carbo has talked about. But in terms of what I've witnessed in the architecture school at Virginia, the kind of some of the most interesting student work that engages digital design is often where there's a very close kind of interplay between model making digitally and model making by hand, rendering that are then drawn over, drawings that are, or three-dimensional representations that are created using the computer, but then used as a starting point for a series of other investigations. And so that's one example of something that I think we maybe kind of, the debates become misconstrued by thinking it's, you have to be an advocate of one or the other, that it's actually the kind of engagement of both.
And this is probably hopefully not an entirely meaningless kind of sidebar, but when the images were going up, the slides were being sort of loaded this early afternoon, I guess one thing I did note is that these images that we're seeing are already in fact hybrid. Even if they were delineated, they've now gone through the kind of pixelization, which is something, and I don't have the citation, I'm sorry, but in 1957 in the US, the first digital image appears, and it's kind of utilizing the photographic grid to pixelate information. Sorry, can't do it any better than that. And so, this question of the hybrid image, I also thought was something that maybe Deanna was alluding to, although it's not digital yet, but and this is maybe a generational position, I might think about the drawings from the 80s, the ones, they're without gravity, or just this kind of collage aesthetic. I mean, is that a version of hybridity? And can that be something that we could think about as a way to, again, in this kind of space of contamination, combine different notational systems, be they metric or affectual or historically distanced from us in time?
Well, something that has gone out of the conversation today, and maybe it's not appropriate, is actually that experience of architecture, what it's about, how we experience, how we live it. And I was really wanting to ask you, and I'm not answering your question.
No, please. Yeah.
But I'm having a little side effect.
Okay.
Do you want to scoot over?
It's this question that your idea that drawing is a fiction. Sure, drawing can be a fiction, but it's also an activity which is not a fiction.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, all right.
I agree.
That's fine.
But
at the moment that drawing, and we're all saying it's sort of old-fashioned to put it in with the humanities, to do with your human experience. On the other hand, without drawing, can you create an architecture that is actually a place to be well experienced, a place to fit well into a city, to do all the things that architecture is going to do? Is there a relationship between a drawing and, in a way, the humanizing and the human experience of architecture too?
I might say if you can, again, cut off the sketch, if it's possible, I don't know that it is, but if you can, in a way, cut off the sketch, the thing that sort of represents the most creative, immediate act, how would you now reintegrate it into the processes? Because I feel like and I believe you said this, that there was something about the seriality and the spacing out over time of design steps, and I think you probably understand this as well from a historical point of view, because you said we've sort of overturned it. But is there at all a difference between serial processes that involve design and, I guess, literally parallel processing in terms of computation? And I don't mean that metaphorically, I actually mean it literally, in the sense that if there's a question about how do we make decisions, or I think what you were saying is that the seriality provides critical distance, right? So is there a relationship, and not really in terms of drawing, is it manual, is it digital, but in the process by which drawing is then reintegrated or sets off a whole chain of design processes?
Thank you for saving me from a difficult one. I'd like to make two comments. The first, I was really struck by the view of the church, the very famous exploded view because actually it's not a perspective, it's an axonometry almost, or a vue cavalière. And that's an impossible point of view. You never see the world like that. Around the same time, Da Vinci sees the city of Imola from, there again, an impossible point of view. And that gives birth to the modern city plan. So there is something in drawing which is not only experiential, which has to do with the abstraction of the impossible point of view. And I think drawing is constantly in tension between the two. And my point would be that, you know, to be human is to be also partly taking non-human position. No eye can see something in axonometry.
Right.
It's not human. So to be, and at the same time, it produces very human architecture. So starting from those premises, I think, you know, if already in the middle of drawing we have non-human experiential traditional things, you know, there are other ways to relate to the world than only drawing. Actually, I don't think drawing is going to disappear, to be clear, but I think there are many other ways for architecture to be human than only to draw. That's all. Just to say that even in drawing, there is a multiplicity of non-human things in these very, and I would agree with Juhani, this is a very core human activity, but which is totally pervaded by non-human points of view, etc. And this is what makes also the price of it. I did not answer directly.
That's
They are
okay.
again.
I think we should have some questions.
I think I agree. I believe there are 2 microphones. Can I see where they are? There's one. So it'd be great if you had a question, if you would please raise your hand, of course, and possibly direct a question to 1 or 2 panelists, if it works for you, just so we can have more questions. Are there really no questions? In the back, thanks.
I'm going to walk down. Hi, is this on? Hi,
Yes.
everybody. My name is John Baymiller. I'm an architect and urban designer. I'm 69 years old, unemployed. Hi, everybody. It's great to be back here. I live in Portland, Oregon. I left New York City intensity 5 years ago and moved to the most civilized city in the country, Portland, Oregon. And I just came back to revere, guess who? Yeah, Paul Rudolph in this building. I was here in the 60s. I'm a graduate of UVA, class of 65. Congrats to you. What I'm holding in my hand, ladies and gentlemen,
Our pens
are
and
pencils and a pen. This is the way I still do it. I don't do CAD. I try to get through email every day. And I just really try to get through email every day, but this is it. This is the way I still do it. I draw by hand. I do 1117 renderings.
We're very glad
I
that
color
you've come
copy, and
back to
thank you very
visit
much.
us. Do you have
And
a
I'm
question?
asking the
Yeah.
question to the audience, okay, is that here we are in the building of this master architect, and there wasn't mention of the guy who drew it by hand. Paul Rudolph was the master of the pen, and he just was brilliant. And here we are in a building by Paul Rudolph, and no mention. The guy who could really draw it. That's all I got to say.
Okay.
We ought to have a half an hour on Paul Rudolph. Thank you.
All right. We'll put that on the agenda next. But maybe that raises a little bit of a point, which is about the space of drawing. Actually, I should probably let that go. I'll let that go. Do we have another question? Yes, Kent.
I think this is to Professor Pallasmaa a little bit, whose remarkable talk on the hand was very, very beautiful. I was going to ask him. You ended up talking about the fingers and the stroke. You several times said strokes of the fingers. Do you extend that stroking action to something which is non-planar in your thinking? For example, the stroke of the sculptor or the person who digs a little deeper into the non-flat wall? Mm-hmm. Because the question came up of flatness a minute ago.
Right.
I think that's a question. Do you extend your promise of the hand to something which is non-planar in your thesis?
Yes, I'm very interested in Merleau-Ponty's notion of the flesh of the world, and in my view, drawing is exactly a very direct way of being engaged with that flesh of the world. And when I am doubtful about certain types of application of the computer is my doubt whether, or question rather, where does meaning arise in architecture? Because there is a tendency nowadays to bypass the issue of meaning completely and see architecture as a pure manipulation of aestheticized form, but that is not something, that is not meaning. Right. Meaning always has an existential ground. It has to do with human life. Right. And in my view, drawing is particularly powerful in excavating that flesh where meaning can arise.
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask that a slightly different way. Is there a distinction that you would make between drawing and carving?
Drawing is a way of carving, I would say, yes. Yes.
So that would then include, in your thesis, sculpture, the sculpture making of, in the traditional sense, correct?
Well, I don't see much difference, in fact, between drawing and sculpting. And if you read, for instance, Henry Moore's fine essays, he exactly makes this point.
Right.
This is just an aside,
yeah, please.
But and this was not my original observation, but another scholar's. But during the period that Michelangelo was carving the Medici chapel or the new sacristy, his drawings revert to a 15th century mode, which is cross-hatching. And the theory has been, and I find this convincing, that he's actually, there's a kind of anticipation of the way that he's going to be making the initial marks, carving the stone. So it's an interesting extension of that.
I guess, Antoine, do you know of any, I guess, contemporary or coming digital interfaces that actually behave more like carving, perhaps?
Well, once again, I don't think the hand is going to disappear. I think part also, for a very also simple fact, is that today, at the beginning, we used to think that the electronic world is going to be useful to map and make legible the real world. Today, we need the real world to understand the electronic that has been proliferating, and this is all these hand-driven interface. And I do believe it's not yet Minority Report and that kind of Hollywood interface, but we are going toward a more and more tactile dimension in order to understand the complexity of the digital world.
Just to take up another point, it's interesting because I think you could have a whole other conference about is not as modeling dead, but how is it changed? Sure, and right. I was actually just talking to some students and people here yesterday about how the challenge of making students understand that modeling isn't just printing, and when they have that possibility. So anyway, right. it's another interesting
One of the
realm.
pictures I showed, by the way, is an experiment by a guy, Ishii, at the Media Lab, in which you model, and at the same time the computer captures what you're doing. And there is a kind of feedback loop between the two, which is one of the things that has been explored, and that is probably where you're going to develop.
There's an interesting suggestion by Adrian Stokes, the British psychoanalytic writer on arts. He divides form making into two categories: modeling and carving. Modeling being additive and carving subtractive process. And he extends that difference also to modes of thinking. And I fully agree with that.
It was a debate in 19th century theory, the primitive cave versus the primitive hut.
Yes,
which was never solved.
But what I have not read so far, maybe Antoine could answer, what type of thinking process does computerized drawing support of the two?
I think probably it's a versatile tool. It will not, you can do primitive hut or digital hut or digital cave.
Can I just ask you, because it seemed to me that this notion of the tactility now in all our new machines is a kind of cynicism on the part of an industry, which said everybody was getting very frightened of computers pressing buttons. What was it going to do?
These are
let them feel
friendly.
it. let them do this, which is a very rude gesture when you come to think of it. I mean, when people started doing it, I
No,
thought,
like that,
yeah.
like that.
No, that's why the iPad gesture is very lovely.
And whilst it's a cynical move in a way to so-called humanize the responses and the using of technology.
Yeah, it might be cynical, but on the other hand, civilizing, the use of any kind of tool doesn't seem to me a bad idea. We did that with a hammer a very long time ago.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think
No,
you
because
remove
there's something very curiously disembodied about this very light touch, where actually you are not making anything happen. In that sense, the hand tool, which normally the aggression or the action of the hand or the mind affected the result. And here you're doing all sorts of things without any kind of tactile reality to it. And so from beginning to end, this is a fiction. That how it's fictional. It seems to me that computers are fictional anyway, but this is a fiction of how we manipulate them. And I think it's a kind of cynical fiction, too.
But is part of the cynicism because architects somehow are not involved in the development of the tool, if that makes sense. So we sort of receive them downstream, and then we say, oh, doesn't it actually do what I want it to do, so therefore do we adapt, do we, et cetera. And so maybe this is a question about the kind of role, disciplinary role in terms of defining technology, or actually how can architects have more agency in not just buying software and I'm an expert, but making the demands based on a whole series of things. Not going to happen.
I think the debate revolves actually about what is it we call materiality.
Okay.
And I think we forget one thing about materiality, that materiality is always relational. That, there is nothing that is material in abstracto. It's always something in which you have a relation. Just look, when I was unable to push the button, that's material, actually, even if it was only an image that did not show. Materiality is a relational, and I don't see that many difference in that respect between what's happening between bracket in the physical world and the electronic one. It's part of the way we relate to the exterior world. But, we might not be able to convince each other.
Cammy,
I just wanted to take.
Cammy can finish.
Oh, just
up
very
and,
quickly, I wanted to take up your point because I think it's an interesting question. I think, some of another more interesting work that I've seen in studio recently was directed by a critic who had an undergraduate degree in computer science. And so she actually knew how to get into the programs, change them, and teach the students to do the same, to tweak them creatively. And I actually think that's another really important avenue that is not being explored, that there's too much of an acceptance of somebody else's authorship and design of the programs as these are the given constraints that we have. But I think that there's a whole realm of creative action and disruption that architects could do if they developed the ability to either design their own tools, software tools, or manipulate and change and disrupt.
Cammy, there were algorithmic artists who developed their own programs.
Right.
It was sort of
I'm just thinking as you talked about voice activation and where that would lead. It may be not the thing to end on.
We don't need interns anymore then. You're talking about voice activation?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, the voice instead of the hand.
Keith.
I guess Antoine was the last speaker, and ended with the notion of fiction, drawing as a fiction, and I can't help but think about the period of time. Now we're 3 years past the crash, but really this boom that we came out of, where a lot of computation was actually directed at in modeling Revit production, building production, and drawing became actually focused on translation to building, rather than expression of thought or argument or fiction.
Right.
And someone, I can't remember who, showed the Liebskin Micromega drawing.
Deanna.
These amazing drawings that were born in, let's say, a period of no building.
Yeah.
And a young point in an architect's career as well, although I don't think he was actually that young when he did that. Relative. As an architect, he was youthful. But would anyone want to, or Antoine maybe, to speak to the sort of drawing in a vacuum of building?
Right.
Let's say this moment in time we're at, and what that might produce in terms of manipulations of the digital, or return to drawing as a kind of exploration around the thought of architecture rather than architecture as a tool, which I really think is where we were for quite a while.
No, I think that's a great question.
You know, one of the most famous passages of the Dictionary of Received Ideas of Flaubert is architect and forgets the staircase. And one of the reasons, and actually it may be true sometimes, and one of the reasons you forget about the staircase is because a building is always the projection, the material translation of something that was partly impossible at the beginning. And in the design process, you are in a contradictory space at a certain moment. And so I think in some way, so that I'm not by the end that fascinated by, you know, there are periods in which we design more, and there are periods in which the exploration of the impossibility of what Massimo could have called perhaps yesterday the problem takes precedence on the exploration of the solution. And there are other periods. I think, and you know, I think it's a natural process. And, you know, of course, architecture, there is the economy in it, but not only. You know, people like Boulez began to explore, you know, these, between brackets, impossible architecture, and with a lot of remarkable drawing, at a time, actually, in which the construction industry was doing pretty well in the late 18th century. So, you know, there's not an absolute connection between the fact that architects begin to do impossible things at a certain point. It's not that strict a connection, historically, actually.
Do we have some other questions in the back?
And there's also a question.
Is there the other microphone so we can line them up? Only one, sorry.
I'm the only one?
Yeah.
I'd like to make an observation to which I would like you to respond or react. Obviously, we all know there are basically two ways of drawing. One is pushing numbers and a button on a computer, and the other is using your body, whether it's your hand or your foot or your mouth. I've seen people draw with all of them. But the purpose of a drawing seems to be the essence of the issue here. Is it to sell an idea to a client? Is it to raise money to build it? Is it because you're an out-of-work architect and you need to sell a drawing? Or is it a tool for the designer to draw with? And so my comment is, shouldn't this symposium be called, Is Hand Drawing Dead as a Design Tool?
No, because the session. I think we're not yet sure. We'll see tomorrow if the digital is alive, right? So, yeah, exactly.
I don't know if I could jump in. I mean, I think for us as organizers of the symposium, the issue was, and this was raised many times today, is the critical function of drawing and how we think as we draw. And it doesn't mean to necessarily limit hand drawing in a sense, because I think people still do hand draw. But as Keith got to, that we've been in such a state of kind of manic production as architects, and there's a tremendous anxiety, which has been raised a number of times, that we're working so much and producing so much, and Antoine talks about the sensorium and the network condition. So much is going on that we're too busy doing all these things that we're not thinking anymore in that sense. And for me, that's the notion where the duress and the death and the sort of decay starts to happen, is in the notion of the drawing. And if I could segue just a little bit to a kind of question that I think Cammy started to get to with the notion of the impossible, and that she raised a little bit, and I think maybe we can try and debate this in some sense, is that working digitally hamstrings us, or I feel hamstrung sometimes, in the sense that you can do certain things and certain nearly impossible things with programs, yet they're still limiting you because there's a kind of mathematical or computational condition that's embedded in the process. Yeah. So your point, I think, is tremendously inspirational is that how can we start to, as architects, take more agency and break down that process in a way that is, it really truly gets at this fiction that we're talking about, right? And creates this kind of invention. And it's, in a way, if I could circle back again, leads us from this fallow period where we're not working as much, that we're attacking and creating agency and thinking again. And that's the fundamental issue, and how we can start to tackle those. I mean, I don't quite know how we get at it yet, but that's part of the notion.
I think Kyle has a question. I don't know if we can get to him. There's no way to get to Kyle. Can I? Okay, in the back, thank you.
Hi, I work as an adjunct faculty member teaching drawing and Photoshop. As a teacher, I'm always interested in...
I'm sorry, it's not quite loud enough. I'm sorry.
Anyway, we're all kind of in this, either as architects or as professors or as students. As a teacher, I kind of interact on both sides. My students know digital so intimately, even more so than I could. You know, I come back and I found out that they've created a Facebook group to talk about their homework, and I didn't even know it. How do we transmit the emotion that we so vividly feel about the tactile to these students who work with such facility in the digital? How do we translate this love to them best?
I think that's a really great and important question. If anybody came to the table with an answer, it might only be that I think Juhani mentioned that there would be a kind of adjacency at a certain point between watercoloring, so by hand, and then a kind of different form of measured drawing. And so maybe I could ask the question that way. Is it about an alignment of hand and computer? How would you teach that?
Well, I'm not sure I completely understood the question, but I think we have been speaking until now about architecture as an autonomous thing, autonomous aestheticized structure. But in my view, architecture, good architecture is always relational. It always mediates. That's the very task of architecture, is mediate between us and the world. And that deals with the emotional and compassionate aspect, which I find are extremely important and very much pushed aside, for instance, in education, the dimension of compassion and empathy.
Okay.
And,
so if it's about mediation and... Okay.
Yes,
I think it's also...
I would just say one more thing, that to my way of thinking, drawing and being physically engaged in the process tends to draw in also these aspects that tend to be left out in today's architecture often.
Antoine?
I don't see it as especially dramatic today for various reasons. The first is any education is an education of the senses, part of it. Baxandall once wrote, historian of art, that to live in a culture is to make a specific perceptual learning. And I think as educators, this is part of what we do. I think in addition, to live in a culture, there is never one way to perceive things, because there are historical strata, because even individuals are constituted, there is a period in which usually you have your thumb in your mouth, then the thumb normally you abandon that habit, etc. There's strata, and I think actually what we have to learn the student perhaps, or to suggest, is how to move from one perceptual universe to another. Touch has not been abolished, but it's in a way extended by other ways. So we have to teach the student that, to move in various culture. And I think, in addition, I think this is more and more the problem today, which is to move from one universe to another. And in some ways, for example, I loved this semester, for the first time in a long time, I've gone back teaching 17th and 18th century architecture to explain moldings, and the play of light on the molding is such a pleasure. And actually, strangely, this is a generation that is probably better equipped than the previous one to understand the mix of abstraction and very concrete nature of the play on light on the moldings, because they have this habit of the computer. And through that, for example, you can relate traditional touch and the more digitally oriented understanding of things.
But Deanna, I know you taught drawing for many years, and so I wonder if that's a question that you have a comment on.
I'm sorry, I'm spaced out.
Oh. We're entertaining you so much.
That's a remarkable.
I have a kind of, well, it's a little bit.
Okay, I think this will be okay, Greg can have a question, but last comment and question.
Okay, yeah, this is maybe seems like an aside, but the closest analogy that I can think of is I had the experience of teaching digital filmmaking in a context in which some of the students had a background in traditional filmmaking and actually editing by hand, so physically splicing things together. And I can tell you that the ones who had that background were tremendously better at things like controlling time and getting a sense of when to end things, because they knew that they had to buy their own film, and the film is expensive. And so there's something that was interesting and telling to me about that. Even if ultimately they were going to become digital filmmakers, that the experience of the constraints that are physical analog constraints is useful. I'm not exactly sure how to translate that to your situation, but.
Great. I think that Greg will have the last question.
I just wondered, for the panel as historians and theorists, if you have any reflections on, let's say, the role that history and theory played in the 1980s in terms of drawing, and the role it plays now, and also the difficulty in theorizing drawing. I mean, it seems like as a historian or a theorist, talking about drawing as a topic is a particularly difficult subset. Maybe it's not, but I just wondered if you see any effects on theoretical and historical work that's gone along with this digital introduction. And by the way, I think it is all the architects that invented all this digital technology. I mean, I think there needs to be a history of this technology, because I think it's probably very inappropriate to say that we received this stuff. I mean, it's all the architects that invented it all, not the people in Hollywood. They took it from the architects. But anyway, that's another topic. But I just wonder, how does this change the way you do theory?
Well, I think I just want to make the point, which is resuming what I was saying in my talk, that I think the most important thing in all of this is a critique. You've returned to history, and in fact, all the time I was thinking, okay, how do we deal with the historical? You're using a nice little example how you use history to teach something for the future. That's absolutely fine, but implied in that is also a kind of critical act. Which is saying that these were solutions that weren't just for the 18th century. These were solutions that had possibilities of use in another time. So you were talking, you were introducing about a critique that we don't have to completely accept all the parameters that are offered to us for architecture today, that we can participate in a critique and a desire to change it, and a desire to extend in a way. My problem with technology is not that it exists, it's that everybody strokes it. Everybody says, isn't that absolutely wonderful? Instead of saying, it's not doing this, it's not offering us a suggestion, it's actually a control mechanism. There are so many other debates about the control of it which haven't come out today. So my answer to all of this is the hand drawing we spoke about, the 50s, the 80s. I don't know if that was a more critical tradition. I don't think it was. A time. I think we're probably much more intelligent, and there are far more complex debates going on. But I think the importance was that something in the hand, and I just say this en passant, is that it was done with a hand, with the same hand that you wrote with, and the same hand that therefore you read with and thought with. And therefore there was a kind of connectivity Whereas I think very often in the digital realm, we're talking about enormous separations of identifications, of people identifying themselves with very small groups, of being identified, and we're not actually seeing a continuity of thinking, planning, changing, a rather utopian world of what I think architects ought to be doing. Okay. After all, you have changed the world, sometimes for the better and sometimes distinctly for the worse.
I'd like to go back to the question you raised, because it's a strange thing, drawing in the history theory of architecture, because I would say in some ways it's both central, and it's so central that actually there are not that many good stuff about it. I think it's related to another strange question in architecture. I once wrote a piece for Perspecta on that, which is why the question of design method is, something we tend to avoid as much as possible when we do history theory, never going to right in the middle of that, as if the center of the discipline was very hard to look at. And it's quite striking that, by the end, all this fascination with drawing of the 80s has not produced a huge body of scholarship on drawing. There are far more things on more marginal questions. And in some ways, I would argue that on the digital, there are a number of issues we don't want to look too closely at, because there is a similar anxiety, I think, with the idea that there is something too central, as if architecture had difficulties looking at its core. With a fear that there might be no core, or the core is diverse, a lot of question. But that's a good question. I don't have the answer as an historian and theorist, but I think it's a really good question. What we're back to is really probably the need at some point to open our eyes and try to look at this kind of incandescent core we know so little about.
That's what Deanna called the black box.
Do we have time for one more question? Yeah? Hi, can you get the microphone over?
I was curious about the relationship between what I would call the author, the idea of the subjective, the subject, and the idea that drawing traditionally was a voice from that subject. And through the use of the digital, the conventions that are used and I do teach the digital, there's at least the novice, or someone starting in it, the ability to actually own it is a lot more difficult, or let's say the path hasn't been identified quite yet. I'm not talking about concept, I'm not talking about scripting, I'm talking about the actual legibility of the author through the touch or the mark. Let's call it the mark making. And what role do you think, and is there a problem in the loss of the author?
Well, I'm sure Mario will address such a question tomorrow, and this is one of the questions on which we totally disagree. But usually, I think it's a fundamental issue today with very discrepant things. On the one hand, there is a kind of hypertrophy of the author. The world is full of star architects. The world is full of 800 million or even more of Facebook authors. So the digital creates, a kind of extended authorship. Truth is that probably the big difference is in the traditional world, you created a drawing, you were the author once and for all. If you want to be an author in the digital world, it's a trajectory. And you're never, and that's true that it goes with an instability. If you have a Facebook profile, you've got to add it, you've got to create connection. It's always something that has to grow. So that creates an instability. And anyway, by the end, this is a debate we will probably not solve, but it's one of the real questions. And it's true, this is part of the anxiety, which is what's becoming of the author. And there are various answers.
Well, the hybrid condition that she was talking about is more about a process. Right. And so if you can use drawing to locate the voice, and then the problem is to make the translation as a problem.
But let's be honest, in a media-driven society, authorship becomes a process, and it's no longer an ontology. But that was already true, by the way, in many respects of architecture before that.
Juhani?
I think there are now two interpretations of authorships. I understood your question to deal with simply the presence of a human individual as the author to which to whom you communicate while you are experiencing the building. And I think that's an essential question. And again, I would agree with Antoine that as a matter of principle, there is not difference between digital methods and hand methods, but in reality there is. For me, the digitally produced buildings usually have an anonymity as if there was no human author, maker behind them. And also a kind of sameness resulting from that, a deja vu, regardless of the perhaps fantastic elaboration of form. I think this is a very central issue, and perhaps the difference between Antoine's point and mine is that I see very great importance in these minute nuances, which either reveal the presence of human intention or wipe it away.
I think
I was just, this may not have been the exact intention of your question, but another angle on this, which I think is interesting, is about authorship as it's changing in the realm of fabrication and construction. And so I heard an interesting talk by Greg Pasquarelli that was about this, that was basically about the kind of dream of total and absolute control of the process so that there were no messy interruptions between the kind of conception and ideation and execution because of the perfection of digital fabrication and so forth. I found this quite alarming, but what I think is interesting is that if you think about kind of early modern methods of construction, there was nothing but pushback. There was a lot of interplay and pushback between first materiality, but then also all of the kind of masons and their experience. And this distinction has been interestingly described recently by Marvin Trachtenberg in Building in Time, when he talks about Alberti as constructing this kind of perfect view of authorship in which anything that disrupts the architect's idea can only make it worse, and a kind of medieval and earlier idea in which the building can kind of change and shift there is no single author and it can change and shift. Anyway, just some additional thoughts.
Seems like that might be a good place to end. I think that question of, if not authorship per se, but the questions surrounding the digital, and hopefully some of the problematics we put forward today will carry over. Thank you, Antoine. Thank you.